Hi, Dave. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you for sparing the time to speak.
Amazing. Before we begin, I'll briefly set the context for today's conversation, and then we'll move into a few questions. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Shan. I'm a principal at Samsung's Global Strategy Group. GSG is Samsung's internal consulting arm with a twofold mission. First, developing global leaders, and second, to create positive business impact for the organization. I've been with GSG for nearly 9 years, working primarily on sales and marketing and advising leaders like Dave. Today's conversation is part of our Distinguished Leader Spotlight series, which is an initiative to celebrate the leaders who have been part of GSG and have gone on to shape Samsung and beyond. Through this series, we aim to capture their journeys, key inflection points, and the leadership philosophies that have defined their careers. Today, we're especially honored to have Dave Das kick off this series. Dave joined GSG in 2003 and has since built an exceptional career across US, Korea, and world, taking on leadership roles across Samsung. Today, he serves as the Executive Vice President leading our mobile business in Samsung America, overseeing our company's most dynamic and critical division. Dave, welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Amazing. Dave, to kick things off, let's start from the beginning. Could you tell us a bit about your background, where you grew up, and what shaped your early interests?
Sure. So I was born and raised in the U.S. Spent most of my time in Urbana-Champaign, Illinois, which is the campus of the University of Illinois. Was fortunate to go to school out east at MIT. I got my bachelor's and master's degree in electrical engineering. I was actually a practicing engineer, a semiconductor design engineer for about 4 years when I did what some do, which is utilize business school to pivot in my career.
Right.
So I got my MBA from Kellogg at Northwestern with a focus on marketing. And when I was graduating in 2003, actually, there were not very many international opportunities with a rotation program in a technology company. So back then, it was a difficult job market, and Sony had a rotation program in the past, but they had wound that down just the year before I was graduating. Back then I think HP had a program, and then maybe Nokia might have had one. But there was also Samsung with the Global Strategy Group. So it actually checked all of the boxes for me, which were number one, working for a great tech company. Number two, it was this wonderful, smallish internal consulting group. And I say smallish because now it's grown much, much bigger. But when I joined in 2003, my class was, I think, around 10 individuals.
Oh, wow.
So it's grown quite a bit since then. But the point is, it's an international company, opportunity to work in internal consulting for a technology behemoth. Although I will say at that point in time, in 2003, Samsung was not nearly as well known, certainly in the US. I think more people knew of it because of cell phones than for any other product. But at any rate, long story short, born and raised in the US, but when I joined Samsung Global Strategy Group in 2003, that was my first opportunity to live and work outside of the US, which was a tremendous experience.
Yeah, and you're aware, like we're close to celebrating our 30 years soon. So how was it in the early days of GSG? I know, like when you joined, it was still our sixth or seventh year, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I joined in 2003. I can proudly say I was not among the original class. I'm old, but not the OG class.
Right.
But it was a bit different. Back then our head office was in Shicheng. It was near the city center, near where basically the town hall is. And it was a smaller building. Basically most of the GSG members were located on site, and then we would do kind of dispatch project assignment based. And then over the years, GSG has grown and grown and grown. Like I said, my initial class was around 10 people, and maybe in all of GSG, there were just over 40 people. active GSG. Of course, some of them had transitioned into line management roles, so we had a bit of an alumni network, but even then that network was not that large in scale.
Right.
So things changed tremendously. Also, I would say the internal within Samsung across all of the different business units, I think the understanding of what GSG was and the value that GSG could provide was also quite different from how it is today. After 30 years, there's a great track record of like countless projects that GSG has consulted upon, across many, many different Samsung business units, not just within Samsung Electronics. So I think the understanding of what GSG is has changed tremendously, but also the sophistication and scale that GSG has developed over the years, that's changed tremendously. And even positions like yours, actually, like someone being able to make a career within GSG, that really
Right.
didn't exist when I joined. The typical model was people would join GSG right out of business school. There were not really many experienced hires. Actually, my class had one person who was the first quote unquote experienced hire after business school. But other than that, it was generally right out of MBA programs. You would do, between 1, 2, 3 years within GSG doing various projects. And then the goal was to transition out into a line management role in Korea. Now, as you know well, Sean, there are career tracks within GSG. You can become, a principal within GSG, which is, I think, a healthy evolution. But many, many things have changed over the years. And yet, I'm really happy to see that a lot of things still have remained the same.
Exactly. And just to contextualize it for the audience, so right now our group size is about 60, 70 people, and we have a steady state of about 25 to 30 folks joining every year. That's like our incoming class. And as Dave mentioned, now the way the group is structured, it kind of reflects any consulting organization, right? Like we have, as you were saying, there was not the structure where you could actually have a career within GSG. Now we have a global strategist, which is our associate level. Then we have EMs that lead projects, then APs, associate principals, and principals, which kind of reflects like any consulting organization. And on the alumni point, I don't know if you know, Dave, but we just crossed over 1,000 alumni.
Wow,
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
That's a far cry from my day when I think we could, count it in the dozens.
Right, exactly. When we were about to start the series, we started looking at how many alumni we have, and then we realized, oh, we just crossed 1,000. So, as you were mentioning, Dave, like in 2003, Samsung was not really a well-known organization, right? So this is a global experience, a rotational, but still, it was quite a leap of faith for you, like growing up in Illinois, spending all your time in US. What sort of convinced you to take that jump across the pond, so to say?
Yeah, it was a combination of factors, but namely the amazing opportunity to work for a brand like Samsung. And as I mentioned, when I graduated, the awareness of Samsung in the U.S. was not as large as it is today. For anyone who's tuning into this, now we're the number 5 globally ranked brand. Back then I don't know if we even made the top 20 list. But number one, however, I think anyone who is in the technology space could see the potential of Samsung and could see how they had grown within Korea and how they had expanded globally and the inroads that they were making in various other countries like the US and Europe. So, to answer your question, number one was the opportunity to work for a global brand with really fast growth and a wonderful portfolio of products. Even back then, even though it wasn't as well known, still like people were aware of Samsung televisions. Of course, now it is the number 1 brand globally. It's been so for more than 19 years, and we have dominant market share in places like the US. But back then it was, it was the number 4 or number 5 brand, but people could see the ascension and the trajectory. So number 1 was the brand opportunity. Number 2 is it was an international assignment, and I'd been very fortunate to be able to travel outside of the US, but never work and live outside of the US. So that opportunity to me was an incredible draw. Then there was this chance to work within the global strategy group. And the beauty of that, especially when I joined, is, if you had asked, hey, Dave, you have an opportunity to work in Samsung, which division do you want to work in Korea? I wouldn't have known because I wasn't as familiar with all the opportunities and trade-offs. But the beauty of Samsung Global Strategy Group is you have that opportunity to work on these projects and essentially assess whether or not this might be an interesting business to join eventually. And after getting a good lay of the land, then you have this opportunity to try and create these career opportunities in line management.
Yeah, it is sort of like a soft landing for sure for a lot of people that have not experienced East Asian working culture, or a scale. Even if you have, to be honest, the scale of something is just something else, and it does provide a wide breadth. And on that, maybe since after you joined GSU, right, and after you've transitioned, can you talk about your career within Samsung? What roles
Absolutely.
have you
Yeah.
taken, and what was the thought process or decision making process behind each of them?
Yeah, and I will share first that I spent about 1.5 years in Samsung GSG and Samsung Global Strategy Group before moving into a line management role. So because of my background before business school, the first couple of projects I worked on were for Samsung Semiconductor because that's where my expertise lay and that's where I could add value on projects. But
Mm.
I kind of raised my hand early in the process and said, I would love an opportunity to work on projects that are for one of Samsung's finished goods businesses, again, whether it's mobile phones or TVs or appliances. So after a few projects on semiconductor, I had a chance to do a project for Samsung India, helping them with their channel development strategy. I had a
Mm.
chance to do a project for Samsung TV, and this was back when we divided things into Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and we were looking at the Western European transition from analog to digital television. So that really dates me for your audience. But it was actually through that last project that I had an opportunity to get to know some of the people that worked for Samsung's TV business in Korea and strike this opportunity for me to transition out into a line management role. So after a year and a half in Global Strategy Group, then I moved to Suwon, which is where
Mm.
Samsung Electronics, kind of functional global headquarters is. I worked in the TV division in Korea for 1 year, supporting the North American market. And then after that 1 year, I had an opportunity to transfer to Samsung Electronics America, and specifically that, SEA, Samsung Electronics America, is headquartered in New Jersey. That's where our North America operations are. That's where our US electronics operations are. And I joined our TV team. I spent the next 14 years there in New Jersey and ultimately led
Mm.
our what we call home entertainment division. So that's televisions and audio. I even had things like monitors and memory, branded memory. So it was a kind of a weird lumping together of products, but the main product was TV. And
Mm.
then in 2020, I had an amazing opportunity to go back to Korea, this time on the mobile division. So I went back to Korea, spent 3 years as the head of North America regional product marketing. So that means based in Korea, based in the mobile division in Korea, but supporting the US and Canada for all things related to mobile.
Mm.
And then after those 3 years in Korea, my second tour of duty, I had an amazing opportunity where I was appointed as president of Samsung Iberia. So I
Mm.
was in charge of all Samsung products within Spain and Portugal, and our Iberia operations were based in Madrid. So my family and I lived in Madrid. I was there for a year and a half, which is far too short. It was a really, really wonderful experience. But then I got the call after that year and a half to come back to the US to run our US mobile business. And so since May 2024, I've been based here in Dallas, which is where all of our US mobile operations are headquartered, in charge of Samsung US mobile.
Yeah, and you can see like from Dave's experience, of course, like the global exposure that you had, and I mean, there's a couple of pivots that you've made, like this, pivot that you made from TV to mobile, right? It is quite a different category. I mean, you essentially grew up in, let's say, after semiconductor in TVs. How
Yeah.
was that pivot, and what was the thought process behind
Yeah.
making that switch?
Yeah, well, first of all, that's one of the most amazing things about Samsung is that you have
Mhm.
this incredible breadth of products, many, many different functional roles, and of course, different
Mm.
geographies. And what is always one of the things that's always kept me so engaged with Samsung and why, I've spent more than 22 years with Samsung is because you have these opportunities throughout your career. And to be able to switch, like you said, TV is fundamentally quite different from mobile phones. And,
Right.
from the outside looking in, one might think, okay, well, they're both electronics, they're both manufactured by Samsung, and they're both ultimately sold to end consumers. But there's actually a lot more complexity in the go-to-market strategies and even the channel partners. Not to mention, there's huge opportunities on mobile from a B2B perspective, not
Mm.
as many on the TV side. We actually have a separate commercial display. But the long story
Right.
short is they're actually quite different, and especially in the way we go to market in the US. So to make that pivot was quite uncomfortable for me, but it was something that I was very excited about and passionate about. So like you touched on, I've been very fortunate that I've been able to work in three different, actually four if you count Portugal, four different countries, across
Mm.
Korea, the US, Spain, and Portugal, across not just two main business units, not just TV and mobile, but actually when I was head of Iberia, that's responsible for all of Samsung products. So that included, again, home appliances, it included commercial displays, it even included medical device equipment and
Mm.
brand memory and some other smaller parts of the portfolio. But it was a wonderful example of how you can really kind of reinvent yourself at Samsung, expand your experience and your horizons, and have these opportunities to move across divisions and across countries.
Right. And which of this switch was, from a learning curve perspective, the steepest for you?
For me, it was certainly, well, actually, I will say, being head of a country was a pretty steep learning curve because then I had to quickly learn all about businesses that I had had no exposure to whatsoever, like
Right.
appliances. But I will say, like, probably the most difficult, like literally thrown in the deep end of the pool, sink or swim, was when I moved from TV to mobile. Because
Yeah.
when I joined the TV division, I was able to kind of learn from kind of the bottom up and do a lot of different functional roles and then take over the US TV business eventually. So it was a 14-year journey, 15 if you count the time in Korea. But when
Mm.
I switched to mobile in 2020, it was pretty daunting because number one, like you said, I had kind of grown up in the TV business. And what that
Mm.
means in Samsung, because these are
Right.
distinct business units that operate pretty autonomously. So I had built my whole network within the TV business, meaning both in Korea and in the US and even across other different subsidiaries in other countries. So I knew the TV business, I knew the people in Samsung Korea headquarters. I knew the customers well, I knew the go-to-market strategies well, and I knew the product well. And then in 2020, when I changed to mobile, it was a whole new business unit. So I didn't know any of the executives in Korea. I didn't
Right.
even know that well most of the employees in Samsung Electronics America on the mobile side of the house, because as I mentioned, I was in New Jersey and everything mobile is in Dallas, where I'm based
Right.
now. So I didn't have as many opportunities to overlap with the broad base of employees. So didn't know the folks in Korea, didn't know the folks in
Mm.
the US as well, didn't know the customers because it's a whole
Right.
different customer set when you think about US carriers like Verizon and AT&T Mobile versus US retailers like Best Buy and Walmart and Costco. So, and on top of that, the technology is different, right? The product itself is
Right.
fundamentally different. So it was three unknowns for me. So that was probably the steepest learning curve. But everybody, the wonderful thing again about Samsung is, especially after you've had a chance within Global Strategy Group to kind of prove yourself and prove what you're capable of, then
Right.
that goes such a long way towards people being willing to give you a shot, right? And the same
Right.
thing happens like, okay, if I've spent time in the TV business, there are lots and lots of people who can say, yes, I'm aware that this person is capable of doing this work, so I'm willing to give them a shot, even though they might not know our customers, they might not know our product, they might not know our go-to-market strategy, but they've shown what they can do in this other part of Samsung, and that's a great kind of leg up that you have by starting in GSG and then getting to vault into these different businesses.
Yeah. And one of the questions that a lot of folks have, and actually I really don't know what your level is about the requirement of Korean, right? I mean, again, for the audience, when Dave
Yeah.
came back to Korea, he was leading the North America product marketing in our mobile business unit. So how good is your Korean, Dave? With
Poor.
22 years
It's
in
it's it's
Samsung.
very poor. I'm ashamed to say how poor it is, but no, at my best, I took my Korean language proficiency exam, and I'm grade 2, as in a
Mm.
second grader. At my best, that was my peak. But and that's after taking Korean language lessons when I was part of GSG.
Mm.
Because I had a little bit of time, and also it was part of the supported, I'll call it requirement. I'm not sure if it's still a requirement, but my
Mm.
colleagues and I were taking classes, but just 2 times per week. Then when I moved into the business unit, and then when I moved to the US, things got very, very busy. I didn't have as much time. When I moved back to Korea, I felt, as you said, Sean, I was managing a group of just over 40 people in Korea, and they were all Korean.
Right.
And while they all spoke English fluently, I was in a lot of settings, especially with senior leadership, with executives, where it was me and a group of Korean executives. So,
Right.
naturally the conversation was in Korean. So I continued taking, or I should say, I resumed my Korean language studies, when I was in Korea the second time around. But I am very ashamed to say that, I did not develop proficiency, unlike some of our other GSG distinguished alumnus who are executives, and they've become quite fluent and actually are conducting business in Korean. Mine is still basically survival level.
For the audience, again, the Korean lesson is provided by the organization. It's 4 times a week. It is optional, but again, highly recommended since you're living in the country. Even if it's not for necessarily required for work, it just makes the experience in the country just much better.
Yeah,
Uh,
I,
I mean,
I couldn't agree more. Actually, I will say, it's not a requisite, right?
right,
I'm proof that you don't have to be fluent in
correct,
Korean to advance within Samsung. And the beauty is all of our colleagues throughout my career, all of the colleagues that I work with have been fluent in English. But obviously it is their second language, especially for a lot of the Korean
right.
executives, like our CEO, TM Rowe, obviously much more comfortable speaking his native language, Korean, as
Right.
opposed to English. And when surrounded by other Koreans, he's going to default to that. But in order to get the most out of your experience, and not just within Samsung, actually just living in Korea,
Korean, yeah.
it's going to be helpful to be able to navigate and to just understand so much more about the culture and everything that's going on. But I think it's a wonderful, I'll call it, bonus that GSG provides as the language lesson support.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do feel that as well. I mean, my Korean is also not that great, but I do feel the way I experience the country and I interact with the people has changed. Even though I know slightly now better, few words maybe, but it does come a long way, and it's quite endearing for the locals to see that you're trying. I do think that. Uh, Great. Let's switch to a little bit gears into your leadership style. Given Dave, you talked about being thrown into the deep end, right? To a certain degree. I mean. Of course, your pivot to mobile was difficult, but then you suddenly being responsible for, let's say, home appliance division in Portugal and Spain, right? A geography that you've not really worked with,
Yeah,
a category that I don't know how much you knew at that point about the category itself.
very
So
little.
yeah, so as a leader, again, like my thoughts always been a leader is a problem solver. They, all they do is kind of solve problems all throughout the day, right? So how do you deal with this kind of ambiguity? Like, what's your framework or what's your thought process, and what does it mean to be a leader in something where again ambiguity is always plenty?
Yeah, I think to address your last question, which is, I think it's just the critical thought and the framework that you bring to the problem.
Mm.
And the wonderful thing about GSG, about the Samsung Global Strategy Group, is it helps you either refine what you already had as a framework, or it helps you create a framework. In my example, I did not have any experience as a consultant before
Mm.
joining GSG. So I was kind of a subject matter expert. And GSG helped me, along with my colleagues, develop this framework. Now, that was way back when, in 2003, and things have changed a lot, so that GSG is structured much more like a traditional consulting company. And so you have more senior people that have had the experience and can help mentor the younger people. But when I joined GSG as an organization, helped provide that critical thinking framework,
Mm.
and approach to problem solving within this Samsung business context that I think, I've utilized throughout my career at Samsung. So, back to your question, The first is, trying to apply that rigorous framework. And I will say one of the best things about Samsung is, we are a very analytic and data-driven organization. But that in that sense, it becomes, you can convince others of your point, and you can steer the company in the direction that you feel is best based on numbers and the persuasiveness of your argument around those numbers, right? It's not about the politics. It's about, the
Correct.
strength of your argument and your data. But the flip side of that is that everybody is very, very well versed in data, and we have so
Right.
many tools to do the analysis. So sometimes it's a debate about the data, and the strategy kind of falls out based on what you are able to prove. But to answer your question, it's framework first approach. But in terms of managing something in an ambiguous situation, what I found, as I've been fortunate to advance within Samsung is, the more I advance, or the bigger my scale and scope becomes, the more time I spend on people. So actually, our founding chairman famously said that he spent more than 80% of his time just on managing people. That means training and acquiring and retaining the best talent possible. And that's actually one of the tenets of Samsung's, beliefs, over decades of success. Putting people first and cultivating and retaining people has been at the top of our list, espoused by the grandson of our chairman, our current chairman, Jay Wiley, still, believes that strongly in people. So back to your question, is making sure that I'm spending so much of my time building and nurturing a great organization, so that my leaders are the ones who are actually the ones coming up with the difficult strategy and evaluating all the pros and cons. And they're the ones saying, at the end of the day, here's 2 or 3 choices, and here's the pros and cons, and here's what I recommend. And so then it's not about me becoming an expert in appliances in Spain, which I had no experience in. It's about making sure I have the right leader and team under that leader to really do the evaluation themselves. And then for me, it's a matter of, okay, persuade me of the path that you want to take. And then can I again apply that GSG initiated critical framework to say, all right, well, let me test a couple of your premises, and then let's see at the end of the day what you presented makes sense or doesn't, and then we go with your recommendation. But it's building the right team and then empowering them to go act on it, while giving them a little bit of challenge and pressure testing.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to unpeel over there, I think, on what you said. On the numbers point, and the data, like how data driven we are. Even to this day, I'm like very surprised and sometimes even overwhelmed when I present to, leaders like you, and your level, where you all really know the details and numbers very well. And I'm really surprised, like, to the level of granularity folks dive deep over here, and it's quite impressive to say the least. And on the people first point, I mean, that does translate to how we function at GSG as well, right? I mean, it's our core mission, the way we focus on recruitment, training people while they're here, giving the right toolkit. So yeah, I mean, it does resonate to my experience and what we do in GSG as well. On the testing premises, that's a pretty interesting one. How do you know what are the right questions to ask your team? Like, what's the and I ask this, Dave, because I mean, I struggle this myself also. Like, I do think I'm a lot more comfortable driving conversations than asking leading questions, and it's a skill I guess takes a lot of time to build. But how do you know, okay, this is the right question that's going to get to the core of the problem and guide my team to solve whatever needs to be solved?
I certainly don't claim to know what are the right questions to ask, nor am I one that necessarily is asking the right questions. I probably ask far too many questions, and sometimes they're probably not the right ones that lead towards a solution. Sometimes they're just because, honestly, sometimes I may not understand fully, and I'm not shy to ask clarifying questions and prove what I don't know. Sometimes there are ones where, I do want more detail, and maybe I have a question behind the question, which I always try and share with whoever I'm asking it to. So it's not just rapid fire, like, tell me this, tell me this, tell me this, why this, why this. It's I try over my time within Samsung, I hope that I've been able to develop this sense of, clear communication of the motive behind either the action or the question, right? So, if I'm asking X, it's because I really want to get to this other question, but first I want to know I'm answering my own personal question, like, is my bigger hypothesis actually valid? So I gotta check that with something, some data. But I think I've also been very fortunate over my career at Samsung to have many, many excellent mentors,
Mm.
both in Korea and the US. And I learned by watching those mentors a lot of different leadership styles, but so many of them were really, really adept at asking questions in a non-confrontational way, a non-challenging way that
Mm.
especially some of the mentors I admired the most allowed the presenter or the business owner to be kind of drawn along to a great conclusion. Meaning, you ask the question, how do you know that the questions that you're asking are the right ones and that are leading to the right outcome? It's actually by watching, some of these mentors that I think I've learned some great lessons. I don't think I'm there by any stretch, but I think it's really about asking, asking in the right way, such that the person who's presenting or who's trying to propose their argument is being very thoughtful about, have they been objective? Have they evaluated it from all the angles? Have they studied what might have been done before? Have they
Mm.
anticipated what competitors or others might be able to do? But it's
Mm.
asking some of these questions at the right time, and then also knowing when not to ask questions, right? Especially if you're in a
Mm.
bigger audience and there are other people who have a valid point of view and who have experience in the area. A lot of times it's best not to ask questions or even to defer and to say, hey, I'd love to hear from you because you're the marketing expert. And I don't
Right.
know, but what's your thought? What would you ask? What would you do differently? And then when you spark some of those conversations and discussions, at the end of the day, if you happen to be the one who's responsible for the business, you've got to kind of have the final say. But my leadership style as it's evolved over the years is very much trying to get as many people involved in the discussion and as many
Mm.
people as possible on the side of consensus, which is not always possible. But then look, at the end of the day, if I'm the business owner, then I'm the one responsible for making the final call. But I'd like to have everyone feel like they at least had a chance to express their point of view.
So it is around demonstrating genuine curiosity and secondly, sharing the broader context with your team, right? The why, doing it at the right time, relying on right people and expertise, and finally learning from your mentors, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. And on
And
the
and trying
mentor,
and trying to and trying to involve, everybody who's in the room
right,
in that discussion.
right. On the mentorship, so I mean, can you talk about some of the mentors that you've had throughout your journey in Samsung?
Yeah.
What was some of the key advice that they've given you, and how that has shaped you as a leader today? I mean, you've talked about the way you see them, ask questions, but beyond that, how that shaped your career.
Yeah. Actually, one of my early mentors is still within Samsung. He's currently the head of Europe.
Mm.
So we have regional heads, and this gentleman Simon Song is the head of Europe. He was so when I moved into the TV group back in 2005, after that year and a half in GSG, he was my first boss. And at that time, he was director and I was a senior manager. What I learned from him is actually a lot of those things that I just talked about, which is making
Mm.
sure that everybody that is in the group has a chance to express their opinion. And also, I will say, back then, I was this was in Suwon in Korea. And it was
Right.
a smallish group. Maybe there were about 15 of us back then it was the LCD TV product marketing group, right? The global
Mm.
product marketing group for LCD TVs. Back when, just as a fun fact, back then we had like our only TVs were for LCD TVs were 15-inch and 17-inch, and they were like
Wow.
$3,000, $4,000. It was crazy. These were the early days of
Yeah.
flat panel, when plasma was the big
Right.
thing in flat panel, and digital light projection, like rear projection TVs were there. We still had tube TVs, but anyway, I digress.
Mm.
The point is, Simon was our group leader, and a lot of the things I just mentioned about ensuring that everybody had a chance to voice their point of view or ask a good question. You know, I learned that from him, and that was even more impressive to me because back then I was the only non-Korean in that group of 15. Now things have changed, and there's certainly a lot more diversity in Korea, but back then, you know, especially when he has 14 people who are able to express their point of view in, you know, in their native language in Korean, and it's easy for him to have that discussion. He actually made the point of switching to English. You know, again, this is almost 20 years ago.
Right.
That actually is an inconvenience for the entire group to
Mm.
not be able to converse as seamlessly as they might like to. But he made the point of making sure that everybody in his team and his group felt like they had an opportunity to contribute. And then, you know, when I moved over to the U.S., I was very, very fortunate. I worked for two great leaders, Tim Baxter and Joe Stinziano. Tim was ultimately the president and CEO of North America. And Joe was the head of all of our consumer electronics businesses, so TV and appliances. And, you know, from them, you know, when you are asking about how to ask the right questions and how do you know that you're leading the group towards the desired outcome, you know, watching Tim Baxter and
Mm.
his very, like, it was non-confrontational, you know, everybody always felt comfortable and at ease, but the way that he would ask the questions and the way he would really lead people along to, you know, ultimately making what I felt was almost always the right decision. That is something that I still admire to this day. You know, and with Joe Stinziano, I had really just, I think that the best mentor in terms of thinking about Samsung's role as a company became not just, you know, like when I joined the TV group, I mentioned we were the number 4, number 5 global player, and then I
Right.
was very fortunate to be part of the journey where we went from, you know, number 4, number 5 to being the fast follower number 2 after Sony to ultimately dethroning or unseating Sony as the number 1 player in the TV industry, and then
Mm.
maintaining that mantle for 19 plus years. But the changes that we as a company went through from fast follower to industry leader to then steward or shepherd for the industry, like
Right.
safeguarding the industry. Like I learned a lot of what that meant from Joe because it went far beyond just saying, okay, how do we gain market share? How do we improve our revenue? How do we improve our profit? To
Right.
thinking more broadly about how do we ensure that all of our partners, that this industry actually is able to thrive and survive. And this is especially in the early days of online businesses and e-tailers where there was just huge cutthroat price competition. So it got to the point
Mm.
where our partners, our retail and e-tail partners, were not able to make money or make profit by selling a TV. And this was not just a Samsung TV, it was all TV brands. And
Right.
so under Joe's leadership and watching him, you know, as a mentor, think about how to shepherd the whole industry and to
Mm.
devise policies that would enable everyone to still be profitable was that was really special, a really amazing opportunity for me.
Oh, that's great. And then, you know, you've had like, of course, as you mentioned, mentors across different parts of your journey and different cultures, right? I mean, Simon's Korean, and then Joe and Tim are, I guess, like Americans, I assume.
Yeah, both
Yeah.
Americans.
And you've also led yourself, you know, teams across different cultures and geographies, right? And you
Mhm.
mentioned a lot of time you do spend leading people, training them, ensuring that you retain the best talent in the organization. So on that front, what are the differences of leading teams in, let's say, again, Spain, Portugal, Korea, US, and what is the one or two commonalities that, anyways, you
Yeah.
know, is across all cultures?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's one that actually I've been asked by a lot of my team members in the different countries. Like that, you know,
Uh-huh.
funnily they say, what is it that what's different between people in Samsung America versus in Samsung Spain versus Samsung
Right.
Portugal versus Samsung Korea? And my answer has always been there's actually far more in common than there are differences, and I think the reason
Mm.
is because Samsung is a special place in that you know it's not for everybody. You
Mm.
know,
Right.
I've always said if you can make it 2 weeks in Samsung, you can make it 2 years in Samsung. And if you can make it 2 years in Samsung, you can make it 20 years. But, there's definite breakpoints where people are like, you know what, this isn't for me, or, it's not a
Mm,
good fit. But I think for me, what I've seen over my time in different geographies is that because Samsung is not for everyone, because it's a bit of a unique company, and especially working for Samsung in a overseas subsidiary outside of Korea, because the parent company is based in Korea, it's very, very different from working for a quote unquote Western headquartered company.
right.
There's the whole cultural dynamic, which is totally different. And being a overseas sales subsidiary, we're taking a lot of strategy and direction from Korea, which a lot of those decisions are made with global best interest in mind,
Mm,
not just, for example, the interest of the US, or not just the interest of a country in Europe, or even Europe as a whole. So the point is being a sales subsidiary, and learning to work within that strategy and doing what is best for your own market within some of that global strategic guideline. That's
mm,
actually part of the wonderful challenge that is working for Samsung. But going back to your question, more in common than there is different, because those people
mm.
who have worked for Samsung for more than 2 years, really they have something core in their DNA, which enables them to thrive and survive within Samsung. And so that's why there's far more in common across all these geographies. And I'd say to go one step further, I think some of those common DNA elements are, you have to have a winning mindset. Like Samsung is
Right,
either number one or number two, or in emerging businesses, maybe we're number four, number five, but we have a plan to get to number two or
right.
number one within a very, very short time period. So it's
Mm,
that, like, never settle for less mentality. Number one, it's also number two, it's a constant paranoia, like a healthy degree of paranoia, because
right.
we have come from, again, in the case of TV business, we've come from a number five position to become number one. We never
Mm,
want to go back, and we are constantly looking over our shoulder to see who is the next Samsung that's going to try and take our market share. And so we are a healthy degree of paranoia, and always challenging ourselves to, like, cannibalize ourselves lest someone else do it. So winner mindset, healthy degree of paranoia, and then I would say actually very detail oriented.
right,
And that goes, back to your point earlier about, like, just the sheer volume of data, but also throughout all levels of the organization. Even our CEOs are required to know, expected to
right,
know, deeply, involved in their businesses, and know a lot of kind of the minutia. That doesn't mean that they're not spending time on strategy. It just means that they're actually much more able to have conversations at all levels of the organization.
right,
And it's because the heads of our business units have grown up within Samsung. Like,
right,
that's actually something that's pretty admirable. They've come through every possible aspect of R&D or finance or sales to then go on and lead one of these multi-billion dollar business units globally. So the point being, Samsung expects attention to detail and knowledge
mm,
of and ownership of the numbers. And that's, I always give this advice to people who are just starting within Samsung. You never know. Again, this is another great thing that I've experienced. You never know, whatever project you're working on. Let's say I'm literally just, I'm doing an Excel sheet, and I'm trying to make an analysis of the US market for some kind of business. You never
mm,
know whose desk that's going to come across, like who's
right,
going to see this in a presentation, and that work is going to be attributed to you, right? So always cross your T's, dot your I's, double, triple check everything as thoroughly as you can. Speed is critical in Samsung. Like, I think that for a company of our size, there's not many other tech companies that move as fast as we do. But you gotta balance that with, do your utmost to make the best finished product within a very short amount of time. And I think in GSG, like, that's how you guys, that's your daily life, right? Is you got to have the best possible output in a very, very short project-based time frame. But I'd say that those kind of three elements are the ones that I see across
yeah,
every geography in which I've worked. If you work for Samsung, if you are able to do those things, it helps you to thrive within Samsung.
yeah. Yesterday, actually, in my Korean class, I was telling my teacher jokingly, the way we set targets in Samsung is it's just 10% compared 10% growth compared to last year. And she was super puzzled. She was like, "Wait, but aren't you guys already the market leader in this category?" I was like, "Yeah, but that's not good enough for us. It's always 10% more." Jokingly, but yeah, it does go to show, the emphasis on growth, and again, to all levels of organization, the level of rigor and detail orientation or depth that's required. To illustrate maybe for the audience, so I just remembered an example. I don't know if you remember, Dave, when HS Kim, he was in the organization. So he was the CEO of Samsung Electronics. He's leading, I guess, $100 billion P&L. And I'm presenting to him, which is supposed to be like about 30-minute meeting. And I was the engagement manager on the project. And then he spends 2 hours wanting to know all the details of how online retailer, how their algorithm works. And I was super surprised that somebody that at his level would want to know the level of detail that he wanted to know. Uh, and then there's another one where I was presenting to the head of corp dev in all of Samsung, and he suddenly wanted to know how the chip works. He goes to me, Shan, forget about the business. I don't want to know the business. Tell me how the technology works.
Mm.
And then we had to give him like kind of a PhD thesis explanation of how the technology works. And it just like is amazing to know that they have the ability and the intellectual curiosity to be able to dive that deep.
Yeah.
On cross cultures, Dave, I mean, you're quite a unique profile even within Samsung, right? Because I mean, you're one of the, let's say, few foreign executives that's leading our sales subsidiary outside that actually has a meaningful experience in Korea, leading Korean businesses, right? And there is definitely this tension of HQ versus subsidiary, right? Where HQ is trying to standardize processes across the world, and subsidiaries, of course, focused on their own local maxima. And then
Yeah.
and you've seen this tension. So how do you balance this? And what is the right trade-off for you?
No, I great question. I actually credit GSG with helping me develop that balance. And I honestly I give this advice to anybody in any country that I meet who's working for Samsung, and especially who has great aspirations for a career with Samsung. I always encourage them to spend some time, whether it's
Right.
6 months, a year, even 2 years, in Korea working in the head office. And the reason, and so back to my point, GSG, you are started off on the right foot, and you actually get a springboard or a leverage point to get into the business units where you've already figured out what you might want to be doing. So back to your point, understanding, ideally understanding what each head of each business, what their strategy is, how they think about a problem, what they might be thinking about in terms of go to market for the next great product. Understanding that from having worked in the head office business unit, and developing that network with people. Again, whether it's 6 months or a year or 2 years, even that isn't, even 6 months is enough time to really start to develop a relationship, and not just in the working environment, but going out for dinner, going out for coffee, going out for drinks. Getting to know those colleagues meant that when I moved back to the US with Samsung after spending, the year and a half in GSG and then the 1 year in the TV business in Korea. When I went back to the US and when I joined Samsung Electronics America, I already had a big leg up on all of my colleagues, my US based colleagues, even though some of them had spent 10, 20 years in the TV industry, right? So
Mhm.
they knew the customers better than I ever would. They knew, the go-to-market strategies better than I ever would, and they've done so much in that industry. But, maybe they didn't understand what our CEO's real strategy and direction was, and kind of the way that that CEO was thinking about certain problems, which I had at least been exposed to when I worked in the head office. And whenever there was a problem, again, because we're a sales subsidiary, right? So our primary focus is sales and marketing, right?
Mm.
If there's something that's related to product development, then all of the, most of the R&D, I should say all, most of the R&D resides in Korea. But I
Right.
had that opportunity to meet a lot of those people, like if not the head of R&D, but at least a lot of the people that worked under that individual. So I had a contact, I had a connection point where I could, even when I was in the US, I could go back to that, contact that I developed from my time there and ask, hey, what's the
Mm,
background on this? What's the real reason why we're going in this direction and not another direction? And
mm,
that was an inherent advantage that someone coming from GSG and someone coming from working in the Korean head office had. It's an advantage that I had over some of my local colleagues that had never had that experience in Korea. So I'm saying all this because your question was about like the balance and the healthy tension. My slight tweak on that is I actually see that as the advantage, right? In
right.
in a in an in a oversimplified way, I feel like I'm somehow able to straddle both geographies, if you will, both
Mm,
worlds, right? So I'm not a Korean executive, clearly. But I also have some different experience beyond what just my local colleagues that have only spent their career working for Samsung in America have.
mm,
So, and then when you add the great experience I've had across different business units, because to be very transparent with everybody on the call, the TV business unit has different cultural idiosyncrasies, like working culture idiosyncrasies and different approach to the market than the mobile division does. And that's different from the appliance division. So, and all that is very, very different from the semiconductor division. So even within Samsung Electronics, there's differences. So having had that experience across these business units, and then certainly across geographies where, for example, like in the mobile space, things are much more carrier dominated in the US, right? It's reliant
mm,
upon carriers like Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile. In Spain, it's much more of a 50-50 kind of open market and retailer versus
mm,
carriers. So the go-to-market strategies are actually quite different. And having had
right.
the experience in both countries actually helps me approach problems differently and think, oh, you know what? I've seen that there's a different way to do this and there's a different outcome that could result. So all that is a very long-winded way of saying that to me, it's less about how do you balance the tension. It's actually that GSG is the wonderful, wonderful entree. It's the entry point for somebody who aspires to make a career within Samsung. It really is the first step in having, kind of one foot in each of the working worlds. And that's an
Right.
advantage that, that will, I think, serve you throughout your career in Samsung.
Yeah. And for folks, I mean, that are looking for an entry point in GSG, that are considering this opportunity, one of the, and I'm maybe leaking a little bit too much, but I mean, this is a thing that we've tested for folks that have gone through the organization that's been quite that have done quite well, that they do demonstrate three traits. First is how adaptable they are. Uh, how second is how well they are able to influence decisions in an organization, and then third is grit, meaning how much they can persevere. And that's what I want to take the next question. Like, I mean, given that you've been in the organization for 22 years, as you said, Dave, and you've done the 2 week, you've done the 2 years, you've done the 20 years, and I'm sure there's been times, right, where you really wanted to give up, or where you were looking down the barrel. What kept you going?
I think it's a number of things. Number one is you're always surrounded by phenomenal people, and I think
Mm,
people in many other companies can say that. I really believe that, and I believe that you're not only surrounded by amazing people, but people who whether they're not Korean or they are Korean. There are people who have really made a long lasting career at Samsung, such as myself. So there are people who are quite loyal to the company. And I think a lot of that has to do with number one, quality of people that we attract, that Samsung
mm,
attracts as an organization. Number two, like I mentioned, there's always that opportunity to work in a different business unit, to work in a different geography. So, not that I ever escaped or ran away from a problem, but I always like you never get too down because you always feel like, you know what, like I always have this opportunity to continue to learn and continue to grow. And
right.
I can always do that still within Samsung and still have a totally different experience. It's like working almost for a different company in
Mm,
some respects, like I said, because each business unit has their own culture. And then third, what's always kept me at Samsung is it's great to be part of a winning team, right? Like, you like I said, you're either number one or you're number two in a business.
right.
And even like very, very transparently in mobile in the US, we are number two. Apple
Mm.
is a clear number one. But
Right.
the scale of our business, just being a number two player, is actually mind-boggling. I mean,
Right.
it's larger than many Fortune 500 companies.
Right.
So being part of this, great organization with so much more runway in front of it, right? I mean, and sorry, the thing I didn't mention as kind of the top three is just the amount that Samsung invests in R&D as a percentage of our sales every year is record breaking
Mm.
in the industry, and certainly in the technology industry. And that means that there's an amazing pipeline of stuff that hasn't even been introduced to the market yet, which is
Right.
going to keep Samsung, in a leadership role across different industries for a long time.
Yeah. Now, this has been a great conversation. For the last question, Dave, if you were to go back in time, maybe 20, 22 years, what would be the one thing that you would tell yourself, like say the GSG self or somebody that is looking to apply to GSG? What would that one advice or piece of wisdom be?
Well, my flip answer is look, study Korean more seriously. That is actually a regret and a bit of an embarrassment that after 22 plus years in the company, my
Mm.
proficiency is as poor as that is. So number one, I would have told my younger self, please spend more time to study Korean. But no, I've been very, very fortunate to have had an amazing journey with Samsung. So I wouldn't necessarily advise doing something differently. What I would say to my younger self, and it's not my GSG younger self. It's actually kind of midway through my career. I mentioned I spent 14 years in TV in Samsung America in New Jersey, and led the TV business for a number of years. I think I would have urged my younger self to get out of my comfort zone sooner. Ultimately, I did. I
Mm.
jumped to mobile, and that was very, very uncomfortable. And I would have said, you know what, do that, 3, 4, 5 years before. Um, just
Mm.
don't. I would have told myself, don't stay in one spot for as long as I did.
Mm.
And again, the wonderful thing about Samsung is you always have that opportunity to move to the next business challenge, business unit, geography, what have you. But I would say like experience all that Samsung has to offer.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Dave. This has been a great conversation. And thank you, everyone, for listening in. We're going to have a lot more of these conversations. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
Thanks, you as well.